The morning of September the 6th, 1943, found 45 B-17 flying fortresses climbing toward their target. 3 miles above the ground, then 5, then higher still, until the earth below became a patchwork quilt of fields and cities. Stuttgart lay ahead, and with it the Bosch factory that American planners had marked for destruction. But between the bombers and their objective waited something far more lethal than anti-aircraft guns. German fighters appeared first as specks on the horizon, then as shapes with wings and guns. They came in waves, rolling through the formation with practiced precision, their cannons flashing in the sunlight. The battle unfolded across the sky like a deadly dance, bombers trying to maintain their tight defensive formation while fighters wove between them, seeking the kill. When the smoke cleared and the damaged aircraft limped home or spiraled down in flames, the mathematics of that September morning told a story nobody wanted to hear. 15 B-17s never came back. That was a 1 in 3 chance of dying, a 33% loss rate. The numbers were brutal and simple. No crew flying that many missions over Germany could expect all of them to survive the required 25. Yet the men kept flying them anyway. But German fighter pilots had discovered something that made their job terrifyingly easy, something American commanders refused to accept, no matter how many bomber crews came home in body bags or didn't come home at all. The belly of the B-17, that entire underside running from the cockpit all the way back to the tail, was completely exposed and defenseless. The FW-1s could match the bomber's speed, hanging in the sky at 250 miles per hour. They positioned themselves underneath the formation in that one blind spot where the bomber's defensive guns simply couldn't aim. From that perfect vantage point, they pumped 20mm cannon shells into the fuel tanks with almost no risk to themselves. The lone belly gunner, cramped and prone in his tight little compartment, could only cover the rear section. Everything forward was completely wide open, a shooting gallery with nowhere to hide. The British had already warned the Americans about this vulnerability. They'd learned it the hard way through years of daylight raids over occupied Europe, watching their own bombers get torn apart by the same tactics. When they heard about Sperry Corporation's radical solution, a man cramped inside a sphere barely large enough for a grown human, the RAF's response was swift and certain. Impossible, they said. A man couldn't possibly endure sitting in something that small for an entire mission. Too cramped, too exposed, far too inhumane. The assessment came from official evaluation documents written by medical officers who knew something about pushing human beings to their limits. It violated everything they understood about safe crew station design. Yet in January of 1942, Boeing rolled out the first B-17 carrying something hanging beneath its fuselage that would force German pilots to reconsider their favorite way of hunting bombers. A sphere measuring just 3.5 feet across, with a man folded inside it. The realization that something had to change hadn't come from reports filed on bomber runways or conversations between commanders. It had come from grainy film footage captured during combat missions, analyzed frame by frame in a laboratory at Wright Field in Ohio. Intelligence officers sat in darkened rooms and watched German fighters attacking B-17C formations over France. The same approach appeared in mission after mission, over and over again, like a script being followed by pilots who had discovered the perfect formula for killing American bombers. 5 o'clock low, the crews called it, coming from underneath, hitting from the rear quarter. The German pilots weren't improvising or taking chances, they were executing a doctrine, exploiting a weakness that American designers had overlooked or simply accepted as unavoidable. The B-17C carried 7 guns total. A 50 caliber machine gun in the nose, 6 50 caliber machine guns scattered around the fuselage at various points. The belly defense consisted of what crews called the bathtub, a gunner lying flat on his stomach in an elongated compartment underneath the aircraft, operating twin 50 caliber Brownings. It looked adequate on paper, laid out in neat diagrams in engineering offices. In reality, the traverse was catastrophically limited. The bathtub gunner could cover maybe 90 degrees of arc pointing rearward. Everything forward of that position stayed naked and exposed to attack. German fighter pilots understood geometry better than American planners had bothered to think through. when an FW-190 came head-on at 400 miles per hour against a B-17 flying at 250. The closing speed exceeded 650 miles per hour. The German pilot had maybe 2 to 3 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before the collision. Most pilots wouldn't take those odds, but coming from underneath changed everything. A fighter could match the bomber's speed and hang in that protected zone below the formation where most of the defensive guns physically couldn't angle downward far enough to reach. From that perfect position, a patient pilot could pump 20mm cannon shells right into the wing root, that structural joint where the fuselage met the wing, where the fuel tanks lived and the hydraulic lines ran. Hit that junction right and the bomber either caught fire or lost control. Either way, it fell from the sky. The Army Air Corps had already tried one solution to this problem. Back in December of 1940, they'd ordered 113 remote turret systems from Sperry Corporation for installation on early B-17E production models. The concept seemed elegant on a chalkboard. A gunner would operate the ventral turret through a periscope while sitting safely inside the fuselage, never exposed to the elements or enemy fire, controlling the guns through electrical wiring. Bendix Aviation Corporation built the actual hardware based on Sperry's design specifications. Testing began in early 1941. It failed immediately and completely. Gunners trying to track German fighters through a small periscope found themselves beaten by the fundamental limits of indirect observation. A Bf-109 pulling 4G evasive maneuvers at 350 miles per hour disappeared from the narrow periscope view faster than any human brain could react. The gunner's instinctive sense of where a target would be in the next moment completely collapsed when they had to look through optical glass instead of seeing with their own eyes. By January of 1942, the remote Bendix system was abandoned as operationally worthless. 113 units had been installed. 0 German aircraft had been confirmed destroyed by any of them. Meanwhile, the British were processing lessons written in blood across the skies of Europe. Royal Air Force evaluators examining American bomber designs in 1941 brought hard-earned intelligence from 2 years of daylight raids over occupied Europe. They had watched Wellingtons, Hamptons, and Blenheims get massacred by Luftwaffe fighters. They had analyzed loss reports until the patterns became impossible to ignore, had developed institutional skepticism built on burying thousands of aircrews. When Sperry Corporation presented their alternative to the failed remote turret, a man sitting inside a spherical compartment hanging beneath the aircraft fuselage, the RAF's reaction was immediate and blunt. Impossible for a man to remain in the bull turret for an entire mission. Too small, too exposed, too inhumane. The assessment appeared in official evaluation documents, a professional rejection based on what British medical officers believed about human endurance at altitude. The Sperry proposal violated every assumption about how crew stations should be designed. It measured 3.5 feet in diameter. The gunner would occupy it in a fetal position, his back and head pressed against the rear wall, his knees drawn up, his feet on rudder pedals, his eyes looking through an optical gun sight mounted at the sphere's bottom. 2 Browning A&M2 50 caliber machine guns would protrude forward, fed by ammunition belts running through the turret's rotation mechanism. The entire assembly would rotate 360 degrees in azimuth and swing through 90 degrees of elevation, powered by electro-hydraulic motors capable of traversing 50 degrees per second. The total weight came to 1,500 pounds when you counted the gunner, ammunition, and all the mechanical systems. The engineering team at Sperry's Lake Success facility on Long Island approached this problem with the cold precision of men accustomed to building gyroscopic bomb sights and autopilot systems. They understood the physics involved. At 25,000 feet, ambient temperature dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Missions over Germany lasted 10 to 12 hours from takeoff to landing. The gunner would need to track targets moving at 400 miles per hour while his own aircraft bucked through flak bursts and turbulence. He would need to survive if the bomber went down, which meant he couldn't wear his parachute inside the sphere. It would hang in the fuselage above him, accessible only if the turret rotated to the exit position and someone opened the hatch from inside. The specifications seemed designed to prove the British right. Height requirement under 5 feet 6 inches. Weight limit 150 pounds. The men who could fit were typically the youngest, smallest members of any crew, often teenagers who had been told their whole lives they were too small for physical work, now being selected specifically because they could fold themselves into a space barely larger than a carnival ride cage. Test pilots who evaluated the prototype in June of 1941 filed reports ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. One noted that the position might be suitable for short-duration testing, but appeared unsuitable for combat operations lasting more than 2 hours. Another observed that claustrophobia and cold injury would likely incapacitate the gunner before enemy action even became a factor. Medical officers predicted frostbite, oxygen deprivation from positional restriction, and psychological breakdown from extended isolation in a metal sphere. The Army Air Corps ordered 250 units anyway. The order went through on June 19, 1941. Before firing tests were complete, before any gunner had spent more than 90 minutes in the prototype, before a single operational question had been definitively answered. The decision wasn't based on confidence in the design, it was based on desperation. German fighter pilots over Europe had already shown they knew exactly how to kill B-17s from below, and American bomber crews were about to enter that same war carrying the same deadly vulnerability. The bathtub had failed. The remote turret had failed. The sphere was the only option left that might close that blind spot before the bleeding became catastrophic. Sperry's engineers at Lake Success worked under constraints that would have killed most aviation projects before they left the drafting table. The Army's aerodynamics requirements demanded that any ventral installation create minimal drag, which meant the sphere couldn't exceed 3.5 feet in diameter, no matter what needed to fit inside. That diameter had to contain a human being, 2 Browning AN-M2 50-caliber machine guns with 500 rounds of linked ammunition, an optical computing gun sight, hydraulic rotation motors, electrical systems, and enough structural integrity to survive combat damage at altitudes where metal became brittle and hydraulic fluid turned thick as syrup. The temperature constraints alone seemed insurmountable. At 25,000 feet, the standard bombing altitude over Germany, ambient air temperature dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Exposed metal would freeze human skin on contact within seconds. Yet the gunner needed to maintain fine motor control for hours, tracking targets through a sight that required constant micro-adjustments. The solution Sperry delivered in prototype form by mid-1941 represented radical adaptation rather than any kind of incremental improvement. The turret would hang retracted into the fuselage during takeoff and landing, then lower into combat position once the formation reached altitude. Entry required the gunner to crouch inside the fuselage, rotate the sphere until its hatch aligned with the access door, then fold himself backward into the interior while a crew member closed and locked the hatch from the outside. Once sealed inside, the gunner assumed a position that defied every human instinct about vulnerability. His back pressed against the rear curve of the sphere, his knees drew up toward his chest, his feet rested on rudder pedals that controlled azimuth rotation. His hands gripped control handles that managed elevation and fired the guns. He sighted through a K4 Sperry computing gun sight mounted between his legs at the sphere's nadir, looking down and forward through an optical window barely larger than a softball. The K4 gun sight represented technology that would have seemed like pure science fiction to pilots from the First World War. It automatically calculated deflection, the lead angle required to hit a moving target, by measuring the turret's rotation speed and incorporating the target's wingspan as input by the gunner. When a Bf-109 crossed the gunner's field of view at 300 miles per hour in a perpendicular pass, the K4 computed exactly where that aircraft would be by the time 50-caliber rounds traveling at 2,900 feet per second reached the intercept point. The gunner simply kept the reticle on target and fired. The sight did the calculus that no human brain could perform quickly enough. The Browning guns themselves fired 750 rounds per minute each, 1,500 rounds combined when both triggered simultaneously. Effective range reached 3,500 feet under ideal conditions, far enough to hit a fighter before the fighter could effectively hit back. The combat radius for shooting was typically limited to about 1,500 feet. where hit probabilities climbed into respectable ranges instead of remaining frustratingly low single digits. When those guns fired, the recoil forces created tremendous stress that the turret's mounting system had to manage carefully, absorbing the shock without throwing off the gunner's aim or damaging the hydraulic motors responsible for rotating that metal sphere. The solution required engineering sophistication, a carefully designed network of springs, shock absorbers, and reinforced structure. Yes, it added weight, but that extra mass proved essential for maintaining stability during accurate fire as the turret swept through its complete rotation at 50 degrees per second. Boeing fitted the first production ball turret into B-17E serial number 412505 on January 14, 1942. The aircraft departed the Seattle assembly line carrying the sphere as standard equipment from day one, not grafted on afterward or installed later in the field. Every B-17 that followed through production's end in August 1945 carried that turret system, making it one of aviation's most prolific defensive weapons ever manufactured. The company subcontracted turret production to Briggs Manufacturing in Detroit, an automotive supplier experienced in precision assembly and equipped with machine tools capable of producing complex hydraulic components in massive quantities. But timing became everything. Boeing was pushing B-17 output toward hundreds per month. Each bomber required a turret. When turret deliveries slipped, aircraft sat idle on factory floors while aircrews in England waited for bombers that existed only on production schedules. The human challenge, though, proved even thornier than any engineering puzzle. Physical specifications demanded gunners under 5 feet 6 inches tall and under 150 pounds. That restriction eliminated most candidates immediately. Candidates who qualified faced 6 weeks of intensive training, covering material they'd never previously encountered. Range estimation meant judging distances to fast-moving targets that strained the human eye's tracking ability. Ballistics instruction taught trajectory calculations, lead angles, and how altitude affected ammunition behavior. Aircraft recognition training drilled enemy silhouettes until gunners could identify German fighters instantly from any viewing angle, capturing those precious fractions of a second available in actual combat. Morse code preparation ensured emergency radio communication capability if intercom systems went down. Fred Waller, a photographer and inventor who'd created wide-angle projection systems for entertainment purposes, designed the Waller gunnery trainer to solve the disorientation problem directly. The device enclosed students inside a spherical screen where multiple projectors displayed filmed combat footage of enemy aircraft attacks, creating realistic visual chaos while students tracked targets using mock gun sights. By war's conclusion, American training facilities were producing 3,500 aerial gunners weekly across all positions, feeding the replacement system that supplied units throughout England, Italy, and the Pacific. Ball turret gunners represented just a fraction of that total output, yet their preparation consumed disproportionate resources because their unique role demanded specialized instruction that regular gunnery courses couldn't provide. Doubt lingered even as production ramped up. Pilots fretted about the 1,500-pound weight hanging below their aircraft, worrying about takeoff performance and fuel consumption penalties. Commanders questioned whether any person could function mentally during those 10 to 12-hour missions, reaching deep German targets and returning. Medical personnel warned about claustrophobia, restricted breathing from chest constriction, severe cold exposure causing frostbite, and the psychological toll of isolation inside a metal sphere, viewing only enemy territory through gun sights. Emergency escape kept everyone concerned. If the bomber went down, the Bull turret gunner needed the turret rotated to exit position. The hatch opened from outside and precious time to climb into the fuselage before parachuting out. Should hydraulics fail from battle damage, the crew faced hand-cranking the turret into position, potentially 15 minutes of continuous cranking while the aircraft plummeted or burned. If landing gear failed and the fuselage touched down, anyone remaining in that turret risked being crushed between metal sphere and runway. These weren't abstract worries. They were concrete problems that materialized over Europe beginning August 1942, when 12 B-17Es attacked railroad yards near Rouen, France, in the 8th Air Force's inaugural combat mission from England. German fighter pilots probed those formations deliberately, searching for weaknesses they'd identified in earlier models. They knew nothing about the sphere suspended beneath the fuselage, scanning the sky with twin 50-caliber guns and a computing gun sight. They'd soon discover it. The 8th Air Force strengthened its English presence through autumn 1942, adding bomb groups and gaining the operational knowledge, separating classroom theory from actual combat. German fighter pilots initially stuck with attack patterns that worked against earlier B-17 versions, approaching from below and behind, where bathtub gunners' restricted traverse left profitable gaps in defense. September brought the first recorded ball turret kills during raids on French targets. Staff Sergeant William Matthews, occupying the sphere in a formation attacking rail yards, tracked an FW-190 through his K4 sight as the German pilot committed to what seemed a safe approach from 5 o'clock low. Matthews squeezed both triggers. The 50-caliber streams converged at 1,500 feet. The fighter's left wing separated from the fuselage in a shower of aluminum fragments and hydraulic fluid. Matthews told intelligence officers afterward, "I framed him just like in training. He filled my sight, I pressed the triggers and his left wing just dissolved." The engagement lasted 3 seconds. The German pilot never reached bailout altitude. Word traveled through Luftwaffe's squadrons faster than official intelligence channels could transmit it. Fighter pilots debriefing after missions across France and the Low Countries reported that American bombers now defended belly approaches with rotating turrets that tracked smoothly through complete hemispherical coverage. Attacks from below and behind, previously the safest approach, now drew accurate fire from gunners who traversed faster than attacking fighters could maneuver free from the engagement envelope. German tacticians studied gun camera footage from surviving aircraft and confirmed pilot reports. The Americans had sealed the blind spot. The Luftwaffe's response demonstrated the adaptability, making them formidable throughout the war. In November 1942, Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II identified the B-17's remaining critical vulnerability through systematic examination of defensive positions. The nose mounted only 4 machine guns on E models, 2 in cheek positions, 1 top-mounted, 1 belly-mounted, with restricted firing arcs compared to the 13 guns eventually mounted on G models. Meyer calculated that a head-on attack, terrifying for German pilots, presented the smallest defensive cone and offered shots at the cockpit, bombardier compartment, and engines 1 and 2. The closing speed approached 650 miles per hour, allowing both sides barely 3 seconds before breaking off or colliding. Such attacks demanded extraordinary nerve. German and American aircraft converged at speeds eliminating hesitation, but pilots with sufficient skill could hold steady through that approach, and the potential rewards justified the risk. By December, head-on attacks dominated against American bomber formations. The ball turret, effective against below attacks, couldn't engage fighters approaching head-on. The sphere's traverse limits meant once a fighter passed beneath the formation and pulled up for a head-on pass, the ball turret gunner watched helplessly through his sight as the fighter bore down on bombers ahead. Top turret and nose guns carried the defensive load during those passes, and their overlapping fields of fire left corridors aggressive pilots could exploit with manageable risk. Yet the ball turret had fundamentally changed German tactical thinking regardless. Captured German pilots revealed they feared the top turret gunner most. Those positions inflicted statistically highest kill rates. But that fear shaped their approach geometry in ways making every attack riskier. Luftwaffe doctrine now emphasized avoiding prolonged exposure below bomber formations. Standard attack profiles became high-speed slashing passes rather than patient, deliberate approaches characterizing early engagements. FW-190s still targeted the wing root junction between inboard engine and fuselage, a critical weak point where structural loads concentrated and hydraulic lines ran exposed. But they executed those attacks from diving passes, limiting exposure to seconds instead of minutes. The ball turret hadn't made belly attacks impossible. It had made them expensive enough that German pilots chose alternatives. Summer 1943 brought the American bomber offensive to maximum intensity. Target priorities shifted to ball-bearing plants, fighter production facilities, and submarine construction yards. Objectives deep in German territory, requiring formations to penetrate hundreds of miles beyond friendly fighter escort range. The 8th Air Force sustained catastrophic losses during those months. Missions losing 30 or more aircraft, 300 men killed, wounded, or captured in single days occurred with grim regularity. John Le Cadeau, a pilot in the 100th Bomb Group, calculated that his unit experienced 400% turnover in its first 90 days of combat. Crews in England calculated their statistical odds of surviving a required 25-mission tour and concluded they'd likely die completing it. Ball turret gunners fought those missions under conditions that vindicated Sperry's engineering while punishing the men occupying the sphere. 10 to 12 hours from takeoff to landing meant 10 to 12 hours in fetal position at 40 below zero, breathing oxygen through masks frosting with each exhalation, watching German fighters through computing sites, while hydraulic wine provided constant reminder that machinery kept them alive. When fighters attacked from below, gunners unleashed 50 caliber fire, generating recoil forces strong enough to shake the entire sphere. Spent shells cascaded up feed chutes and ejected into collection bags. Ammunition counters clicked downward. Hydraulic fluid heated by friction in rotation motors sometimes leaked from damaged seals, spraying into turret interiors where it froze into slick films on every surface. Statistical records showed ball turret gunners were crew members least likely to receive combat wounds. Armor plating surrounding the sphere and the small target profile provided exceptional protection compared to waist gunners or tail gunners operating from open or minimally protected positions. But that protection carried corresponding vulnerability in other scenarios. Every landing with damaged gear raised possibilities of the turret being crushed if the aircraft belly landed. Every mission where hydraulics failed from battle damage meant crews hand-cranking the turret into exit position, while the aircraft potentially fell or burned. The sphere protecting gunners in combat became a trap when mechanical systems failed at worst moments. The deterrent effect proved as valuable as actual kill statistics. German fighters spotting ball turrets rotating and tracking, guns following their approach before even entering firing range, often broke off seeking easier targets. Intelligence flowed both directions. German pilots learned that stationary turrets signaled crew casualties, hydraulic failure, or ammunition exhaustion. Locked turrets marked bombers as primary targets. Formations learned maintaining the appearance of full defensive capability, even with knocked-out positions, because German pilots based targeting decisions on visible defensive activity. The sphere became a signaling mechanism as much as a weapon, broadcasting aircraft fighting capability through nothing but rotation and traverse. August 17, 1943 marked exactly 1 year since the 8th Air Force's first mission from England. The anniversary mission targeted Schweinfurt and Regensburg, ball-bearing production facilities and Messerschmitt factories deep in southern Germany. 376 B-17s launched, 60 were lost or damaged beyond repair. Ball turret gunners fought to human endurance limits, tracking targets until ammunition ran low. Hydraulic fluid leaked from battle damage and fingers went numb from cold despite heated flight suits. They brought their bombers home through fighter attacks, pressing from first German airspace penetration until formations crossed back over the English Channel. The sphere had proven itself in combat. The question became whether any defensive system could protect crews against hundreds of German fighters rising to meet them. October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday before sunset over England. 291 B-17s launched for the second Schweinfurt raid, targeting ball-bearing plants, producing 60% of German production capacity. Intelligence estimated that destroying those facilities would cripple German armor and aircraft manufacturing within months. P-47 Thunderbolts escorted formations for the first 200 miles before turning back at fuel minimums. Bombers flew remaining 200 miles unprotected. 300 Luftwaffe fighters waited. Inside ball turrets, gunners tracked the developing attack through K4 sights as German fighters assembled into formations stretching across the horizon. The Luftwaffe had evolved beyond individual pilots, making opportunistic passes. From 25,000 feet, the Bull turret gunners watched something deeply troubling take shape above and around them. German fighters were organizing with methodical precision. Waves of Bf-1109s and FW-190s moved into line abreast formations, spreading across the sky in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm the bomber's defensive capability through sheer numerical force. No single gunner could track and engage multiple targets happening simultaneously. The Germans had understood this mathematically before they ever fired a shot. The tactical calculation was devastating in its simplicity. If 6 fighters attacked the same bomber from different angles within a 3-second window, at least 4 would find themselves with uncontested firing opportunities. No matter how skilled the men manning those guns were, the numbers simply didn't work in their favor. The hydraulic whine of turret motors became a constant, almost rhythmic sound as gunners spun to track one fighter after another. The twin 50-caliber Brownings unleashed their fury in response, firing at combined rates that reached 1,500 rounds per minute. Each burst sent recoil pulses shaking through the entire sphere, rattling the gunner's teeth and bone bones. Spent shell casings tumbled through the feed chutes and into collection bags that quickly filled beyond capacity. Hot brass scattered across the turret floor, a gleaming carpet of spent ammunition. When German fighters pressed attacks from below, the computing sites acquired them with precision, leading them perfectly. The fighters were forced to break off their runs early or accept fire that punched straight through aluminum skin and severed the control cables running through the aircraft structure. Yet the sheer volume of attackers kept coming. While one Bull turret gunner engaged a Bf-109 at 4 o'clock low, another fighter would attack from 11 o'clock high, an angle where the Bull turret's physical limitations prevented the gunner from reaching. The Germans understood these constraints and exploited them ruthlessly. The mathematics of aerial combat favored German tactics. A B-17 required an average of 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells before it fell from the sky. The aircraft's design redundancy and multiple engines absorbed damage that would destroy smaller bombers outright. But Luftwaffe pilots achieved only rough 2% accuracy when firing at evading targets under combat pressure. This meant each pilot needed to fire nearly 1,000 rounds to accumulate the 20 hits required for a kill. If engagement stayed one-on-one, the mathematics favored the bombers. But coordinated attacks changed everything. 6 fighters firing simultaneously generated 6,000 rounds into the same target zone, virtually guaranteeing the 20 hits needed regardless of individual accuracy rates. Bull turret gunners in damaged aircraft faced exactly the scenarios that British evaluators back in 1941 had predicted would prove impossible to survive. When hydraulic systems took damage, turrets refused to rotate to the exit position without manual cranking. This required crew members to access the hand crank mechanism inside the fuselage and turn it continuously for as long as 15 minutes while the aircraft fell or burned around them. Some gunners spent those agonizing minutes watching altimeters unwind through their sights, calculating whether they'd reach exit position before the Earth rushed up to meet them. Others found themselves sealed in turrets on bombers making emergency landings with damaged gear. During belly landings, the turret would be crushed between aircraft and runway if anything went wrong. The position that provided exceptional protection during combat became a death trap when mechanical systems failed during emergencies. The October mission statistics documented catastrophe. 60 B-17s were lost outright, shot down over Germany or ditched in the Channel. 17 returned so heavily damaged they were stripped for parts rather than repaired. 121 more landed with battle damage requiring extensive reconstruction. Over 600 aircrew members were killed, wounded, or listed as missing, nearly 20% of the men who'd launched that morning. Bull turret gunners who survived reported engagements where they fired until ammunition ran dry, then continued tracking targets through their sights just to maintain the deterrent effect of a rotating turret even after the guns fell silent. Some remained in their spheres after hydraulics failed, unable to exit but unwilling to stop scanning for attacks, because stationary turrets signaled vulnerability that drew German fighters like predators scenting wounded prey. The losses proved unsustainable by any operational measure. American aircrews couldn't statistically survive their required 25 mission tours when individual missions inflicted double-digit percentage casualties. The mathematics were brutal and unyielding. 8th Air Force commanders faced agonizing decisions about whether daylight precision bombing remained viable or whether the entire strategic concept should be abandoned in favor of British-style night area bombing that sacrificed accuracy for survivability. The Bull turret had performed exactly as designed. Gunners engaged every target that entered their fire zones, scored kills when ammunition and opportunity aligned, deterred attacks through visible defensive capability. But isolated defensive systems couldn't overcome coordinated mass assault by hundreds of fighters, particularly when escort protection was temporarily absent. The dark irony emerged in post-mission analysis. Statistically, Bull turret gunners were the crew members least likely to be wounded during combat. The armor plate and small profile protected them better than waist gunners standing in open windows or tail gunners in minimally protected compartments. But they were also the crew members least likely to survive if the aircraft went down. Bailout procedures required them to exit the turret, enter the fuselage, retrieve their parachute, and then jump. This sequence demanded time and functioning hydraulics that damaged bombers often lacked entirely. Crews learned to extract Bull turret gunners early during emergencies, rotating turrets to exit position while altitude remained sufficient for manual cranking if hydraulics failed. But the procedure required discipline and communication during moments when aircraft were burning or descending out of control. Not every crew executed the procedure perfectly under those conditions. The October losses included Bull turret gunners who died still sealed in their spheres. Some were in aircraft that belly landed with failed gear, crushing the turret against the runway. Others were in bombers that went down over Germany with turrets that wouldn't rotate to exit position due to battle damage. The families of those men would eventually receive telegrams stating their sons were missing in action, later updated to killed in action. They received no details about how men who survived the fighter attacks died because mechanical systems failed when they needed them most. The military classified those details as operational information, unsuitable for next-of-kin notification. By mid-October, deep penetration missions were suspended. The loss rates had reached levels threatening the 8th Air Force's ability to continue operations. Replacement crews arriving from the United States couldn't keep pace with the attrition. Morale deteriorated as veteran crews calculated their odds and concluded survival was statistically improbable. Commanders considered abandoning the daylight bombing campaign that had consumed thousands of lives and hundreds of aircraft. The B-17's defensive systems, Bull turret included, had been tested to destruction against coordinated Luftwaffe opposition and found wanting, not because the turret failed its designed function, but because no configuration of defensive guns could overcome numerical and tactical superiority by an enemy controlling the airspace. German fighter pilots were winning. The sphere beneath the bomber had closed one vulnerability, but the strategic equation demanded more than closing individual blind spots. It demanded control of the air itself. In October 1943, the Luftwaffe owned the skies over Germany. The crisis reached its apex as the 8th Air Force hemorrhaged crews faster than training schools could produce replacements. Loss rates on deep penetration missions climbed to levels that made 25 mission tours a statistical death sentence. Morale collapsed as experienced crews who'd survived through skill and luck calculated their remaining odds and found only mathematics pointing towards certain loss. Memorial services now outnumbered mission debriefings. Commanders filed reports to Washington acknowledging that daylight precision bombing might prove operationally impossible without fundamental changes to either tactics or available resources. The Bull turret continued performing its designed function, defending the underside against attacks that had once come with impunity. But isolated defensive improvements couldn't overcome the strategic reality that the Luftwaffe controlled German airspace and could mass fighters against any formation penetrating beyond Allied escort range. The solution arrived in February 1944, not as a replacement for defensive systems, but as a complement that transformed the entire tactical situation. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with external drop tanks, could escort bombers 1,650 miles into Germany and return, finally providing the long-range fighter protection commanders had demanded since the bombing campaign began. Deep penetration raids resumed with Mustangs flying top cover throughout entire missions, engaging German fighters before they reached the bomber formations. The combination of escort fighters handling threats at distance and bull turret defense preventing close-range attacks from below created layered protection that proved survivable where either system alone had failed. German pilots captured after D-Day and interrogated about Luftwaffe tactics confirmed what mission reports had suggested. They feared belly attacks specifically because of bull turret effectiveness. The rotating sphere with twin 50-caliber guns and computing sight forced them to make high-speed slashing passes rather than paced approaches that maximized accuracy. A stationary turret, tail guns locked in neutral, top turret not traversing, ball turret frozen in one position, signaled a wounded bomber and marked it as a primary target. German pilots learned to identify which aircraft in a formation still possessed defensive capability by watching gun activity. If the bull turret was rotating and scanning, tracking potential threats even before they entered firing range, that bomber had functioning hydraulics, an alert crew, and ammunition remaining. Avoid it, find easier targets. The tactical shift revealed the bull turret's value extended far beyond actual kills recorded in mission reports. The deterrent effect, the way rotating turrets influenced German attack geometry, proved as strategically significant as fighters shot down. Luftwaffe doctrine evolved throughout the war to minimize exposure to defensive fire zones. When bull turrets made belly approaches costly, German pilots shifted to head-on attacks. When nose armament improved in the B-17G model with chin turret installation, German pilots adapted again, seeking angles where defensive coverage overlapped imperfectly. The constant evolution demonstrated that the Luftwaffe respected American defensive systems enough to adjust tactics rather than accept losses. The sphere beneath the bomber had become part of the calculation German fighter pilots made before committing to any attack. The final validation came not from American assessments, but from operational statistics compiled over thousands of missions. Bull turret gunners routinely spent 10 to 12 hours in the sphere during missions over Germany, proving the British evaluation from 1941 fundamentally wrong through simple endurance. The position the RAF deemed impossible for a man to remain in for an entire mission became standard for every B-17 mission from January 1942 through August 1945, when production ended. Sperry and Briggs Manufacturing produced over 12,000 bull turrets during the war, equipping not only B-17s but also B-24 Liberators and Navy PB-4Y patrol bombers. The Sphere became one of the most produced defensive weapon systems in aviation history, specifically because it solved a problem conventional solutions had failed to address. The earned catharsis for bull turret gunners came in increments rather than single dramatic moments. Each formation that returned with all aircraft because coordinated defense and escort fighters kept losses within sustainable rates. Each German pilot who chose a different attack angle because the rotating turret beneath the bomber promised accurate return fire. The men who occupied those spheres were teenagers selected because they were small enough to fit into a space designed primarily for ammunition and guns rather than human comfort. They defended a blind spot that doctrine said couldn't be defended from a position that medical officers said couldn't be survived. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the operational record was complete. The bull turret hadn't made B-17s invulnerable. No defensive system in warfare ever achieves that. But it had closed the door on the approach German pilots found easiest and safest in 1942. Attacks could still come from ahead, above, or the sides, but coming from below, where early B-17 models had been exposed to attack, now cost German fighters in blood and aircraft. The price of that vulnerability closure was paid by men who spent half a day at a time in fetal position at 40 degrees below zero, breathing oxygen through masks that frosted with each breath, tracking targets through computing sites while their bomber bucked through flak and turbulence at 25,000 feet. The sphere measured 3.5 feet in diameter. Mission durations reached 12 hours. Operating altitude was 25,000 feet, where temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Gunner weight limit remained 150 pounds. Ammunition capacity was 500 rounds. Rotation speed was 50 degrees per second. Over 12,000 B-17s carried the Bull turret into combat. Every German pilot who flew against American bomber formations learned to respect the underside defense that shouldn't have been possible. The Bull turret didn't make B-17s untouchable. It made them survivable. It closed a gap that doctrine and conventional thinking had left open. It asked men to fight from a position that seemed designed to prove human limitations. Those men climbed into the sphere anyway, mission after mission, because protecting that blind spot mattered more than comfort or conventional assumptions about what humans could endure. When engineering meets desperation and both meet courage, sometimes the impossible solution becomes the only one that works. The sphere beneath the bomber proved that radical adaptation beats incremental improvement when the enemy has already figured out how to kill you. The Germans could still attack American bombers, they just couldn't do it the easy way anymore. In a war where margins measured in percentage points determined whether crews lived or died, eliminating the easy approach meant everything.